John Lagimodiere is the publisher and editor of the Eagle Feather News, and I've asked John to come today and give us a little bit of insight into a number of the Indigenous affairs and matters that are happening in our community. John, thank you for making time for us today.
Randy, thanks for having me on your show.
I want to maybe start with, we have the Truth and Reconciliation. We've had a number of major fronts in the news with regards to some of the issues that you write about and cover. Maybe let's start with the latest, and that's been the release of the survey Canada-wide.
Interesting survey. I was a little disappointed that some media outlets took the headline that said, racism growing in the West, worst in the West. Yeah, you can pull that out of there. And who in Canada didn't know that racism was worse in the West, is my thing. If you read into that report, I'm really heartened by it. That report has summarized the feelings of Canadian people towards Aboriginal people. And now it's all of a sudden turned that we're almost at about 75% are aware of and understand the Indian residential schools and the impact in the community. One thing though we have to work on there is that only 30-some% were aware of the actual Truth and Reconciliation Commission and their calls to action and reconciliation going forward. Also in the report, what was super exciting was that most people, like a vast majority, said, yeah, we should fund First Nations education and health and all these other things properly so that there's, they have the same opportunity as your average Canadians. And 8 out of 10 said that they wanted to learn more about the issue. And that shows to me that Canadians are engaged at a level of interest on Aboriginal issues that we've never seen before in Canadian history. So even though there's some gaps in there and they need to learn about the TRC and all these, a few other things, engagement levels are high and we're starting to see that change in the community. So the issues we're facing in First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities in Canada can't be undone or fixed strictly by the community itself. It needs political will, it needs Canadian neighbors. So having more people engaged like this can bode only well for the future.
So taking that information, there's going to be the next step. So Saskatoon has implemented the 1-year recognition of the Truth and Reconciliation.
Yes.
On a number of fronts, and education is one of them. What happens after that 1 year is over?
I hear you. I'm frustrated by deadlines on reconciliation, and there shouldn't be. Canada has a hard history, and it took us 140 years to get to the situation we're in here in Treaty 6 territory. And it's going to take us more than 1 year or 6 months or a short timeline to get it out. And what the TRC really pushed forward in their calls to action was acts of reconciliation. So there's an act of reconciliation pointed out in the calls to action for municipalities, business, culture, sports, church, political groups. There's something there for everybody. So what they're hoping is that these acts of reconciliation continue on. And an act of reconciliation could be as small as walking up to someone at a public function and shaking their hand and acknowledging them and saying, hi, I see you, welcome. Little things like that can help bridge divides and gaps. So yeah, we have a month of June is going to be heavy, right? There's lots of things happening here. The big walk down by Victoria Park, we're excited about those things. But we can't stop there. And I think with this report, the way Canadians are starting to see the gig and the way federally with the new Liberal government, the attitudes have changed very much so. And so that's bringing a lot of hope to the community. So it's just a process. And we got to keep going, and it's not just having political people tell us when we can start reconciliation ceremonies. It's an individual thing, and everybody has to have their own acts of reconciliation. And we'll be all better along the road if we do it.
So I think that's important to point out is that come July 1, it's not as though it's over.
We still got work to do.
So it's something that we'll continue to work on a go-forward basis. Talk a little bit about the name change for the FSIN. There was a Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. There was a vote, and that was changed. What happened there?
Well, there's a couple things. Number one, the geographical boundaries that were set forth by their name and the word Indian, right? We'll start with geographic boundaries. Treaty 6 transcends Saskatchewan. It goes in Alberta, spreads around, and the geographic part of Saskatchewan was made way after the treaties were signed. So part of reclaiming their identity and their terminology and is deciding how they want to be identified as. So they've gone from Federation of Saskatchewan to Federation of Sovereign. They're still independent states. nations within nation, of Canada. So there's the sovereign, sovereign part. And then they took Indian and went Indigenous. And with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of the calls to action was for Canada to adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So internationally, people aren't saying Aboriginal or Indian. We're one of the only countries in the world where if we say Indian, we also have to say, when we clarify East Indians, we're one of the only countries in the world like that, because Indian people are from India, not Cree people from South Saskatchewan. So that being said, they've changed from that imposed word of Indian to the more preferred internationally recognized word Indigenous. So it's a little bit of housekeeping. Some people are still okay with Indian. It's not an offensive word if it's used in proper context. But that was their decision they made. And the good thing is it kept the acronym. You know what I mean? Because I did have to learn a new acronym. So I don't think there is a whole lot of opposition to it. And I think it was just time as names evolve. This was the next step.
Can you shed some light on just the political sensitivities? If many are in the community, well, I don't know what to say. Is it an Aboriginal or Indian or First Nations person? Is it Indigenous? Is this the new politically correct word that we're going to use, or is that, you talked about the context?
Yeah,
So,
if you use Indigenous, you're good. You're safe. It's the most politically correct, understood. Everybody's okay with it. Aboriginal, here's the catch though, Randy, which is frustrating for me sometimes. Aboriginal is the three distinct Aboriginal groups in Canada. So Indian, Inuit, and Métis, as defined by the Constitution. What does Indigenous mean? Well, people like in Indian, Inuit, and Métis. So it's still a broad word, and we have to remember underneath those broad words are very many distinct tribes, cultures, communities that have different relationships with the government of Canada, different relationships with their neighbors. So we can't pan Indigenous people, but the word is a good use to describe the First Peoples. And that's
all-encompassing and inclusive in that sense.
And that's what it is.
Sure.
But when you're at the Métis Nation, Saskatchewan, those are Métis people. You say Indigenous, it broadens it. Hey?
So on a wider note, the Supreme Court of Canada with the ruling on the Métis, tell us about that.
Okay, so it's called the Daniels decision. And a guy named Harry Daniels said, look, the federal government has a fiduciary money responsibility for Indians and Inuit, according to a particular section of the Constitution. And he says, how come the Métis aren't? And the government says, well, you're not a federal responsibility, you're a provincial responsibility. So as a Métis organization, they would go to the province and say, hey, we got a housing issue in, say, La Loche. And the province would say, no, you're Aboriginal, Métis are Aboriginal, so you're a federal responsibility, go to the feds. So they would. And the feds would say, no, we're just responsible for Indians and Inuit. Go to the province. Tick, 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 you're in a jurisdictional wasteland. And we still got a housing issue in La Loche. So Harry Daniels said, for the sake of services and funding and problems, the feds should be directly responsible to the Métis. And he won at the Supreme Court of Canada. So basically what that means is that for the sake of some things, Métis people have to be seen as Indians. So it didn't make me a status Indian as a Métis person. It didn't give us benefits, doesn't give us treaty rights or anything like that. It just clarifies a fiduciary responsibility for the federal government to the Métis. That's it for now. What it's going to lead to in 10 years, don't know.
That means that the old back and forth that you talked about is now a federal responsibility.
Yes.
Okay. That
Clears
clears the playing field and maybe makes a better demarcation of what the rules are and
jurisdictional programs, who pays for this, who's responsible for what, instead of having people fight over it, clarity. And clarity helps everybody.
What can you take us out with in terms of what's coming in the next 5 to 10 months of Saskatchewan politics and the Indigenous affairs of the province? What do you see coming in?
Within the next few months, the Métis Nation is going to finally have to pull its stuff together. They've been unfunded for the last several months because of political infighting, but they're going to have one of their general assemblies in the end of July and an election in September. So there'll be new Métis leadership. People are thinking come September. The FSIN is going to be calm for a while. They don't have any elections coming up. And we're just expecting more relationship building coming down the pipe from the feds. They've really come out and promised a lot of things, How that gets implemented and put rubber on the road, we'll see. You know, so things are going to be relatively just kind of business of the day. And I think everyone's kind of hunkering down here in this kind of economy and taking care of that business and creating those relationships right now so that we can all benefit and prosper when things start to turn around.
John, I can't thank you enough for your clarity and your upfront manner, and I really appreciate you making time for us today.
My pleasure, Randy. Thanks for having me on.
Good. We'll be right back after this message.